Senator, very glad to have you here, and I thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure.
We appreciate it.
You bet.
I want to start right off with one of the issues that voters and our viewers tell us are most important to them, and that's inflation.
Sure.
2 years ago, inflation was at 9%, a crazy number. It's come down recently to under 3%. I know the Fed is talking about lowering the borrowing rate, and they may continue to do that.
Would be hugely helpful.
Depending on circumstances. But there are still New Mexicans who say, I have trouble paying rent. I have trouble paying for groceries. Your thoughts?
One, I'm really proud of the work that we did in the Inflation Reduction Act to bring down costs, especially in the energy sector and as well as prescription drugs. I mean, we finally gave Medicare the ability to negotiate for cheaper drug costs for seniors, which was a big inflationary, like something that New Mexicans feel very viscerally is prescription drug costs. I think as a nation, you know, we saw our supply chains broken and we saw the impact of inflation on that. And that was a worldwide phenomenon. A lot of countries have not been able to manage it back down to 2 or 3%. They're still sitting in the very high single digits. But I think it was a lesson for us that we need to build things here, especially mission critical things, because that's how we ended up with such outrageous inflation. And so we passed things like the Chips and Science Act, saying we're not going to leave it to other countries to make these chips. We need to be able to make them here so that car prices don't explode the way that they did. And now we're seeing Intel at Rio Rancho make major investments because of that policy.
Briefly, if you would, talk to me about groceries and talk to me about housing. These are things that are hammering people in New Mexico right now.
With respect to housing, I mean, the real answer is we need to build more housing, and we need zoning reform so that it's easier to, for example, add additional quarters on single-family residential lots. Those are the only things that are going to bring down those prices. With respect to groceries, I mean, what we've seen is a lot of what's called shrinkflation, which is profit-taking, and there needs to be some oversight on that. That's when you have a bag of Oreos and suddenly you have the same price, but you only get 2/3 as many Oreos.
Tell me what you think about the minimum wage, the federal minimum. And we're talking about just over $7 right now.
It's terribly out of date. I mean, I raised the minimum wage when I was on the city council, for goodness sakes, and that was about the last time the federal government raised the minimum wage. It's become very mired in partisan politics, and it takes 60 votes to raise the minimum wage, and there's, to my knowledge, you know, there aren't any Republicans standing up and raising their hand and saying we need to do this. I think it's one of the reasons why we need to reform the filibuster. It's too easy to say no to things right now in Washington, D.C. You can sit in your office and say, I object to raising the minimum wage, and you don't even have to go to the floor and argue against it. There needs to be skin in the game from all of us with respect to those kinds of policies.
Mr. Heinrich, you've been a senator for 12 years. Your opponent in this race says you've been absent from New Mexico and that you haven't done enough for people, working people in New Mexico, in terms of the things that are most immediate to them. Your response?
I'm here every weekend. You know, my family's here. My wife works in Santa Fe. My oldest goes to UNM. I'm constantly in New Mexico. And the work that I've done is to literally double the budget and the direct jobs in our national labs to work on projects that put New Mexicans to work. You know, you take the Sunzia project, that's a $20 billion impact to the Southwest, and it means that linemen, union linemen from across New Mexico can find jobs building that infrastructure. We passed the infrastructure bill that is investing in things like broadband, and so right now, if you're in the skilled trades, it's a good time to be a New Mexican because of the investments in real solid infrastructure that is growing jobs in our state.
Thing you're most proud of from your time in the Senate?
The thing I'm most proud of is passing probably the PACT Act, which gave veterans the ability to get coverage for all of the toxic exposures in Iraq, Afghanistan, people who worked next to burn pits for years. Those people are covered by the VA now. They weren't before, and I'm very proud of that.
I want to shift the discussion now to abortion. We have the overturning by the Supreme Court of Roe v. Wade. This is an issue that matters to people all across the country, women across the country, and here in New Mexico.
Republicans said they'd never do that.
In the interest of clarity, your position on abortion rights?
I think we leave it up to women, and it's a decision that should be made between individuals and their health care providers.
And I want to be comprehensive here. In vitro fertilization has been part of this discussion as well. It's one of the few ways that some New Mexicans conceive.
Right.
It's a real gift in that sense, but we
Sure
also
is.
know that it destroys embryos. Your position on IVF?
I support IVF, and I actually think we should codify access to IVF and access to contraception. Some of the things that we've heard from at least one of the Supreme Court justices suggest that they could roll that access back the way they did with abortion access through Dobbs. I think we should codify both of those things.
Your opponent, Nella Domenici, in this race says that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. This is something I think we've heard before. And she says she opposes a federal ban on abortion. Is it fair to say that your position is not far off from Ms. Domenici?
No, I think we have very different positions. She attacked me when I supported a national effort to codify Roe v. Wade. I think that if you elect Nella Domenici to the Senate will be Republican, and they have an agenda for a national abortion ban. So in effect, what you're doing is facilitating a step towards that national abortion ban.
But her official position is that
Irrespective of what her decision is, the folks who are going to be the majority leader in the next Senate have all said, we're going to do this.
Let me be more direct about this. A woman voter in New Mexico, hearing both your positions, they don't sound far apart. And there may be people who say, well, I just as soon vote for her.
Look at what I do, not what I say. I mean, if you look at, there's a great New Mexico saying that translated is, tell me who you hang around with and I'll tell you who you are. And all of the folks bankrolling her campaign have been committed to this national abortion ban that is laid out in great detail in Project 2025.
I want to shift our attention now to the border.
Great.
You've been a senator for 12 years now. You're seeking a third term. This country is awash in fentanyl. Fentanyl is everywhere. Not only is it everywhere, but it's so cheap.
It's cheap.
It tells you something about the supply, that we're not having an effect on the supply. We have illegal immigration in this country that many people think is just unsustainable, especially for cities and people trying to take in these folks. Would you agree that we don't have control of the border?
I think our asylum system, which is what this current wave of immigrants, what has created it, is deeply broken, and that we need to reform that. And we had a very good proposal on the floor, negotiated with both sides, with some of the most conservative Republican colleagues of mine, that would have gotten a handle on the asylum system. And Donald Trump told Republican senators to walk away from that deal because he'd rather have an issue for the election than to solve problems. I think we should solve problems. I've been at the table 3 times now for real substantive immigration reform, which includes making the documented legal immigration easier and making it harder to abuse the asylum system that the cartels have gotten very good at abusing. We need to do that.
Could you tell me, because there is talk about the negotiated deal, and we had some honest people on both sides making compromises and coming to the middle. Tell us about the changes and the places that the Democrats went that some people thought they might never get to.
Well, for example, we take the asylum process, and people can no longer just be released into the interior as part of that process. But what they get is the whole process is not 10 years long. It's literally a matter of months. So we take that process, we compress it down. People who still qualify for asylum, and it is a high bar, would get that answer in 6 months. But other folks don't get released into the interior for 10 years before they find out that they're denied and then have to leave.
What's the biggest thing that the Democrats gave up, quote, gave up in that compromise, in that debate, in that discussion?
Well, I think we recognized that we weren't going to get other things that we wanted done that are very important to me. For example, I wanted dreamers in that deal. I think people who have grown up here and know no other country, we should have them on a fast track to citizenship. And there should be a high bar for what we expect of them, but we should make dreamers citizens because they are an incredible asset to our country.
There are people who criticize the Democrats for being too late to this issue.
We were at this issue in 2013 when we actually passed immigration reform through the Senate. I think it was 68 votes. House Republicans refused to put it on the floor. We went back to the table in 2018, worked with Marco Rubio, tried to do it again. Stephen Miller, the immigration, I don't know what you call him, but Trump's right-hand man on anti-immigration policy, killed that deal in 2018. It had massive funding for border security, and we were back at the table this year. It has been Republicans time and again who have walked away from actually solving this problem.
Let me give you an example, and we may disagree about this, but President Biden this summer passed an executive order saying, okay, we're going to go back to this rule in terms of asylum. If you come here illegally, you're no longer eligible for asylum, right?
Right.
So if you enter illegally. Almost immediately, you had a precipitous drop in the number of people crossing into the United States illegally. It made the issue on the border much more manageable.
Right.
That was something he didn't pass 3 years ago. He didn't inject 3 years ago, right? It feels late in the game to be saying, hey, we need to do this.
I supported what the president did. I don't know if it'll be durable in the courts, and that's why we need to change the laws that govern these systems.
What's the most important thing we can do to secure the border?
The most important thing we can do is really address the challenges we have in our asylum system. Because so many of these folks are showing up actually at ports of entry. They're not crossing in between. They're actually showing up and saying, I want asylum. We also need to address fentanyl, and that means we need to fund the things that find fentanyl when it's coming into the United States.
And almost all of the fentanyl is coming in through border checkpoints.
Not only through border checkpoints, but most of it's being carried by American citizens. We need the scanning technology to be able to find that stuff. It's why I helped secure $400 million specifically to finance those truck scanners and those pedestrian and passenger vehicle scanners that actually find the fentanyl.
Senator, let me ask you, and shift gears here. After inflation, crime is one of the most important issues to New Mexicans. Tell us what you have done at the federal level as a two-term senator.
You bet.
To make people safer.
First off, pass fend off fentanyl. That is a law now, and it gives tools to law enforcement to be able to go after the bank accounts of the cartels who's been moving fentanyl into the United States. Secondly, I passed major gun crime legislation as part of the bipartisan gun bill that was passed 2 years ago. We went after gun trafficking, and we went after straw purchases. So straw purchases is where someone like myself, who can legally own a firearm, goes into a gun shop and buys it for a felon or a domestic abuser, gives them that gun, and then they use it in the crime. That used to be a paperwork crime. The legislation that I helped write now makes that a prosecutable, do hard time crime.
If I may, we have done a story, I want to say within the last year, of a woman who was accused of buying 10 handguns at a time. She has no criminal history, so there's nothing wrong, there's nothing illegal with her buying those weapons.
Until she transfers.
Handing them to her teenage son. He goes off and sells them, makes money, makes cash on these things, and only comes back to his mother after he sold 10 guns onto the street to people who have no good intentions for them. And she buys another 10 guns. So the law sounds fine, but I don't, sometimes in the newsroom you cover these stories and you say to yourself, well, where's the enforcement? Well, I mean, if there's a law in the books that you can't do that, you can't be a straw purchaser. And this is something, Senator, with respect, we find out after the fact. We find out after the fact that you've got 10 guns that were used in crimes, and they say, oh, it turns out all of these guns come back to this person. It seems like this is upside down.
It is upside down right now because we have, as a country, not addressed our gun crime problem for 30 years. We're just now putting the laws on the books to give DAs and U.S. attorneys and other prosecutors the ability to go successfully after people who commit those crimes, straw purchases, gun trafficking as well. We always assumed that gun trafficking was a problem where guns would be coming into the United States. So we wrote our laws that way. Now we've changed the law to say when you traffic firearms to Mexico, to Central America, those firearms end up in the hands of cartels. That in itself is a federal crime. And so we have to adjust the law, but we also have to have prosecutors who are going after those individuals and making real examples out of them.
Would you believe me if I told you that's not happening? I mean, the example I'm telling you didn't come before this law. I mean, it wasn't legal to do what this woman was doing when she did it. Right? It was illegal then. It was just something that no one seems to be paying attention to.
We are awash in handguns right now, and I think we really need to focus on prosecution because we're starting to build the muscle memory of the laws that can hold people accountable. But it's still someone's job to hold those people accountable.
I was speaking to, and this is exactly on this topic, I was speaking to Raul Bujanda, who's the head of the FBI here in New Mexico. Here's an experienced lawman, and I said, Raul, tell me, what do you think is the biggest driver of crime in our state? And I offered some possibilities. There's bail reform, there's policing, there's all sorts of things. And he just laughed at me. He sort of shrugged his shoulders and he said, Dean, there's too many guns.
There's too many guns, there's too many narcotics.
Everyone has a gun. Every teenage delinquent who wants a gun has a gun. And every criminal who, whether they're a teenager or not, if they want a gun, has a gun. As you mentioned, we're Washington guns. We have more guns, and I think we passed this recently, more guns in the country than we have people now.
Yeah.
How do you solve this problem? It seems intractable in the sense that
you can't do it immediately. But this is part of an agenda that for 30 years the NRA and groups to the right of the NRA said we want no rules. We want a permissive environment for firearms. We have to start taking control of our own destiny again and passing laws that hold people accountable, but then actually having law enforcement and prosecutors do the hard work of holding those people accountable.
On that topic, what do you say to New Mexicans, and we have plenty of them who own guns, care about guns?
I own plenty of guns.
Are concerned about their Second Amendment rights. What do you say to those voters?
I think there is an obvious path forward here where you protect people's ability to use firearms in a traditional way. I'm a hunter, I recreate with guns, I own some guns for home protection. All of that can be protected, and we can still say you shouldn't have a 30-round magazine on your AR-15 that allows you to walk into a movie theater and kill dozens of people before anyone can do anything about it.
That speaks to the larger sort of mass shootings, but it seems to me that there are far more people dying in our streets from just the bad guy with a handgun. That happens every day, all the time.
I think we need to end this culture of permissiveness where everybody thinks they should own a handgun all the time. If you own a car, you have to meet certain requirements to be able to drive the car, to have insurance. You have a responsibility if you own a firearm, and I think the law should recognize that there should be limits and boundaries and responsibility.
I'd like to shift now to a different topic that's always on the periphery, but I think it's very rarely at the center of any political campaign, and that is the federal debt, the federal deficit spending. In fiscal 24, I think we spent $1.5 trillion more dollars than we brought in. The federal debt, I think, is $35 trillion, somewhere maybe upwards of that number now. It's more than 100% of GDP and has been for a while.
Yep.
There are serious economists who believe that this is not sustainable, that we're on a path that is ruinous in terms of our economic future. And we're talking about the future of younger people, too, coming up, who are going to be saddled with this debt. Your thoughts on deficit spending and the debt?
Well, if you look back in time at when that exploded to an unmanageable level, you can tie the lion's share of it to the Trump tax cuts. Those tax cuts did not benefit average New Mexicans. They didn't even benefit, moderately wealthy New Mexicans. They were so concentrated in the upper 10% that, in my view, one of the healthiest things that we can do long term to make our spending sustainable would be to let those Trump tax cuts expire.
Beyond that?
Beyond that, there are things that we should do within programs like Medicare and Medicaid to bend the cost curves in Social Security. There are many things that in an exchange, in a negotiated exchange, I could settle for. I don't think somebody who's making several million a year necessarily needs Social Security. We could means test that. That wouldn't be my proposal, but I'd be open to that if we could roll back some of these tax cuts that have just exploded the deficit.
How urgent is this problem to you?
I think we're approaching a time. I don't think it is a problem that we can't solve, but it's going to take both sides getting together and saying we're willing to do things that our side doesn't like, and we need to do that sooner rather than later.
You pride yourself as a senator for, I think what's called bringing home the bacon. You fight for the labs. We have Los Alamos National Laboratory. We have Sandia National Labs. We've got Kirtland, Holloman, Cannon Air Force bases. And you fought hard, and as someone with some tenure now, are in a better position to do that. How do you reconcile? You're bringing home billions of dollars to New Mexico.
So the top lines in the appropriations process are the top lines. it's my job to make sure New Mexico does better per capita than my colleagues. And I will do that, and I have done that. It doesn't change the top line spending number that any individual subcommittee appropriations chair gets. But within those bills, I'm going to make sure that New Mexicans' needs are addressed. And we have doubled both the budget and the raw number of jobs at both our big national labs. And we've looked out for New Mexico's interests. New Mexico does an enormous amount of work for the national security of the nation. And I'm going to make sure that it continues to be able to do that work effectively.
How do you reconcile that with deficit spending?
Once again, if I didn't fight for our labs, if I didn't fight for our bases, it wouldn't change the top line number in any of those spending bills. So what I believe is it's my job to make sure that within whatever that top line spending bill is, that New Mexicans' needs get addressed.
I want to speak briefly about something, and there's some, just to be candid, this is some self-interest here. Broadcasters traditionally have always been responsible, and people in print media, newspaper people, responsible for what they broadcast or they print.
Yeah.
We've moved into an era we have social media is hugely successful, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in revenue. Some of that money has come out of the broadcasters and out of the pockets of print media. The social, and I don't think everyone necessarily understands this, that the social media players, whether it's Facebook or Instagram, they're not responsible for their content. Right?
And they're also not paying the actual providers of content. If they're scraping from a local paper or a local television station, there is no compensation to those entities either. So it's kind of the best of both worlds for them. They get they get the revenue, but they get none of the responsibility.
They get free content and none of the responsibility for that content. Right. Congress is responsible for this. Congress passed the laws protecting them and giving them the right to say, well, we're just a billboard. We're just a Section 230. Yeah, people are just putting, they're just posting what they're posting.
I think it was a huge mistake.
How do we get back to something that's more sane?
There are a number of legislative proposals to do that, but it means that we actually have to take on those tech companies. And some of my colleagues are willing to do that. I'm willing to do that, but not all of them are willing to do that. And so we're trying to build a coalition that gets us back to a healthier democracy and the kind of free press, for lack of a better phrase, that served our nation so well for over 200 years. And if we don't do that with AI, we're going to be in the same boat.
Okay. We're in a place where the country's probably never been more polarized, or maybe it's never felt this polarized anyway. How do we get back to having a discussion between people on the right and the left and feeling like we have some common ground?
I think the most important thing is to listen and to recognize that when we are embracing and tolerant of each other, even with our differences, we can disagree on whatever. We have to be able to work together and produce outcomes. And if we don't do that, we're just giving a huge leg up, a huge advantage to our competitors in the world, to the Russias and the Chinas and the Irans.
Structurally, where do you think this polarizing atmosphere that we find ourselves in, where does it come from? It's
from people consuming information through a soda straw instead of with a wider lens. There are so many people who are getting their news not from a local television station, not from a local paper, not from the sort of historical sources, but from someone's blog that is disconnected from reality. And it creates a very fractionated information environment. People are socially not interacting as much as any of us would like. I mean, there's a huge social value to a thing like a front porch, knowing your neighbor. I don't care if your neighbor has a different political sticker on the back of his truck than you do. Treat him with respect. We are stronger as a country when we realize we're all in this together.
Senator, we're almost out of time. I'd like to lighten this a little bit. We're coming to this perfect time in New Mexico where the summer heat is fading. What is your favorite time of year in New Mexico? And maybe a memory from that period or something about it that you find joy in.
Elk season.
Explain this.
And it's usually, I didn't get a tag this year. A lot of New Mexicans can relate to that.
Yeah.
But
I didn't either, by the way.
My best memories are of like September or October, up in the Aspens, hunting with one of my sons, cold nights, campfires, everything that comes with being on public lands outside in the fall in New Mexico is pretty much perfect.
All right. Any last thought about New Mexico you'd like to share?
So I've got a pretty good recipe for elk carne adobada.
Okay.
But you'll have to catch me at the grocery store or the county fair, and I'll share it.
All right. Senator, we thank you for
Thank
your
you.
time.
My
We
pleasure.
appreciate it.
You bet.